Welcome, Pene. Thanks very much. Gosh, it's hot. I was living in Canberra until June last year, so I'm finding this Brisbane heat rather amazing. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we're meeting and thank them for that very warm welcome. I would hope that the rest of us learn to welcome refugees and asylum seekers in the same gracious and tolerant way. Last year, shortly before we all went off on our Christmas break, Parliament did a dreadful thing. It passed a raft of changes to the Migration Act and the Maritime Powers Act, which is the kind of legislative change that I haven't seen since the arrival of the Tampa, when there were 7 bills that were passed in 2 days and just rushed through the Houses of Parliament. It introduces a raft of changes deliberately designed to hurt refugees and asylum seekers, people who are seeking protection in Australia from violent and dangerous situations abroad. So a number of the things it does. First of all, there are new interception of powers to ensure that asylum seekers can be detained at sea and returned to whence they came, without regard to our international obligations, including that fundamental principle that we do not return a refugee to a place of persecution. And the Parliament has hoped that it will keep the courts out of any further actions like the one brought on behalf of one group of Sri Lankan asylum seekers, again, eventually decided in favour of that group of the government, but nevertheless the government was clearly scared enough that it needed to introduce changes to ensure that the courts simply couldn't get involved. And of course, as you know, one of the groups of asylum seekers was kept at sea for 29 days in detention in fairly appalling conditions while the government tried to send them back to India. So clearly we're going to see more of that kind of action. The definition of a refugee, hammered out at the end of World War II when the world said never again, has been unilaterally altered by our Parliament as well, so that we're no longer in step with accepted interpretations by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the courts in other countries, or even our own High Court of Australia. Some refugees and asylum seekers will not be able to get review of negative decisions by the Immigration Department, which does sometimes make the wrong decision. Others will have only a very limited form of review by a new body called the Immigration Assessment Authority, and that body will not actually have an interview generally with the asylum seeker. They will make their decision based on the files handed over by the Department of Immigration. So where is the fair hearing in there, and how is that consistent with international standards of due process? And of course there are many risks that we will in fact send people back to persecution with that kind of mechanism in place. Temporary protection visas have been reintroduced, which prevent people from reuniting with their family in Australia. So some of them will be facing the prospect of indefinite separation from their family members, and we'll see exactly the same kind of misery that we saw last time round in the Howard era when temporary protection visas were in place. It is amazing to me that we can be so stupid as to keep making the same mistake and just repeat and repeat over and over again. Meanwhile, mandatory detention is still in place. It's been in place for over 20 years now. And instead of reading and listening and absorbing the compelling report by the Australian Human Rights Commission, our government has chosen to attack a very eminent and principled human rights lawyer, Professor Gillian Triggs, and they have accused her, very wrongly in my view, of playing politics. The reality is that it's governments who have played politics with vulnerable people's lives, and it's not just this government, unfortunately, it's successive Australian governments who have done this. Under the rubric of stopping the votes, governments hope that they will win votes. And the question for all Australians is, when will we say enough? When will we say, as Australians have done with the disastrous budget measures that the government tried to introduce last year that targeted vulnerable Australian citizens, when will we say, well, this sort of treatment of refugees and asylum seekers is rather like those budgetary measures? It just isn't according people a fair go. When will we say that two wrongs do not make a right, and that you cannot combat people smuggling by punishing the desperate people who use the smugglers? When will we say to our government, we need to be more creative and think of other ways? Can we cooperate with other governments to share responsibility for refugees and create lawful ways of moving from one country to another? Our government will only do that when we stand up and say that this continued assault on refugees and asylum seekers is inconsistent with our values. It's un-Australian. It's against the rule of law. It's against that idea of the fair go and our legendary egalitarianism. Refugees are just like us. In fact, many of us have been refugees and asylum seekers, and this country is so much the richer for having hosted those people. It's time to say welcome, as the traditional owners of this land said to us before we started the meeting, and to get rid of these policies of cruelty and misery, because they really are not who we are as Australians. Thank you.